Well, this morning we are continuing our series through the Old Testament book of Daniel. The book of Daniel. We are in the sort of prophecy or visionary side of the book, chapters 7 through 12. And this morning we're going to look at chapter 8. So I invite you to open your Bibles with me. Turn there to Daniel chapter 8, and we'll be exploring this entire chapter together. This morning, if you need a Bible, please feel free to use one of the Bibles that's provided for you there in the seat backs. If you use one of those Bibles, you'll find this morning's passage on page 145. Page 145. So Daniel, chapter 8, beginning in verse 1. Follow along as I just read this chapter straightway through so we can really get oriented to it, and then we'll dive in detail together. In the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, and I was at the Ulai canal. I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had two horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward, northward, southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the two horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his two horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And instead of it, there came up four conspicuous horns toward the four winds of heaven. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the hosts and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it, together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression, and it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it, and behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called, "Gabriel, make this man understand the vision." So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, "Understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end." And when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep and my face to the ground, but he touched me and made me stand up. He said, "Behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia, and the goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which four others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the latter end of their kingdom, When the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great, and without warning he shall destroy many. And he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true. But seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I rose and went about the king's business. But I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. All week long, I've been thinking to myself, what do rams and goats and horns have to do with the everyday lives of God's people today? And then it dawns on me. Goats can scream under pressure just like humans do. There's the connection. Did you know goats scream? It's the screaming goat. Here's some pictures on the screens of some screaming goats. Did you know that you can waste hours of your life watching YouTube videos of screaming goats? Has anybody done this? Any confession? Okay, there you go. I see your hands. I'm not alone. In light of this phenomenon, this screaming goat phenomenon, some clever person actually invented a panic button called the screaming goat button. I happen to have one right here. That's the screaming goat button. You see it? There's a goat on the face of it right there. And so how this works is that when you squeeze it, you can hear the goat scream like this. Come on, that's awesome. A screaming goat. Wait for it. Man. Put that right there. So look, here's the idea. When you're having one of those days where the meetings pile up and the deadlines mount and things go south and you're totally overwhelmed, you could just go back to your office and you can go over to your desk and you could just hit the screaming goat button. Just let it all out. It releases your stress, makes you feel so good about the pressures of the world every time. It's the screaming goat button. Well, the screaming goat button is actually, all kidding aside, it's actually very profound, I would argue, because it represents a whole approach to the world. It's the approach of panic. The screaming goat button represents that moment when you just can't take it anymore and you just panic. But here's the thing, friends. As God's people, when we face the threats and sufferings and trials and challenges of our world and in our everyday lives, you and I have two choices. God's people must choose between panic and trust. See, we can hit the panic button, or we can trust. We can trust the providence of God and the promises of God. For us, it is panic or it is trust. This, I think, is the lesson that Daniel had to learn through this visionary experience that we see here in Daniel chapter 8. The text divides up into three parts. We're going to see the vision, the meaning of the vision, and then a faithful response to the vision. Those three parts. Let's take a look as we work our way through. First of all, notice the vision there in verses 1 through 14. We're told there, if you'll glance at verse 1, we're told that this vision takes place in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar. So Daniel is still serving in the Babylonian court. He's still serving under Belshazzar the king. And we are actually 2 years later than the vision in chapter 7. It's about 547 BC. Verse 2 tells us that Daniel is transported in the vision to the city of Susa. He's roughly 220 miles east of Babylon. He's in a city that would soon become the winter headquarters for Persian kings. So the vision takes place in a major city of the next world empire after Babylon, that is Medo-Persia. And Daniel is taken to Susa and to the banks of a large man-made canal next to that city. Well, then the crazy starts, right? Verses 3 through 4, Daniel sees this ram with two large, gnarly, curly horns, right? And one of those horns is higher than the other. The ram charges in fury to the west, to the north, to the south. No one can stop him. No one can stand up against him. That is until we get to verse 5, where this goat suddenly appears, charging from the west. This goat is fast. It's so fast that it doesn't even touch the ground as it flies. It's like the Roadrunner from Looney Tunes, you know? It has one large horn between its eyes, so it's like a unicorn goat. That's awesome. Remember, horns represent kings and their power in these visions. So this goat empire is led by a solitary, powerful king. That's the idea. Then in verses 6 through 7, this goat collides with the ram. It breaks the ram's horns. It tramples the ram under feet. In other words, this is one empire toppling another. In verse 8, the goat becomes great and strong. But suddenly, all of a sudden, the horn is broken, and then it's replaced by 4 horns. In other words, one king is replaced by 4. Next there in verse 9, we see that this little horn appears and grows up out of one of the prior 4 horns. This little horn becomes very great and expands his power to the south and to the east. And then we read that he expands his power toward the glorious land. You say, what is that? The glorious land? Well, this is Daniel's clear description of the land of Israel. So as Daniel has this vision, he sees this little horn growing and then eventually taking control of God's people in their land. And now things go from bad to worse. In verses 10 through 12, we read that this little horn wages war against the armies of heaven. He throws down God's people, pictured here as stars. He declares war on God himself. He stops the animal sacrifices of the Jewish temple. Remember, he's in Israel at this point. He desecrates the temple precinct, and he disregards God's commands. So look at verses 10 through 12 again with those details in mind. So we read then at verse 10, it, the little horn, grew great, even to the hosts of heaven. So it's even attacking the armies of heaven, as it were, the angelic armies. And some of the host and some of the stars, that is God's people, it threw down to the ground and it trampled on them, and it became great, even as great as the prince, capital P, the prince of the host, that is God. He's trying to be as great as God. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, from God. In other words, the Israelite sacrificial system is taken away, and then the place of his sanctuary, that is the temple precinct, was overthrown. Verse 12, and a host, God's people, will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression, and it will throw truth to the ground. It will violate God's commands, and it will act and prosper. So put this all together. This is a blasphemous, tyrannical assault on God's temple, God's people, and God himself. The little horn will do all of that. Next, Daniel listens in on an angelic conversation. Look there at verse 13. Then I heard a holy one, an angel, speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." So what are these angels speaking of here? Well, they're asking, how long will this terrible suffering go on under this evil little horn that we've been reading about? The angel answers the question, it will go on for 2,300 evenings and mornings. Now, you need to know that scholars debate exactly how to understand this number. Is it talking here about 2,300 days, assuming that evening and morning describes a day? If so, then this period of persecution described here will last about 6 years and 4 months. Or another view is that the evenings and mornings describe the evening and morning sacrifices at the temple. If so, this is 2,300 total sacrifices, making it 1,150 days, or roughly 3 years and 2 months. So, will the suffering last for 6+ years, or will it last for 3+ years? Look, either way, the point is the same, really. Here's the message. This suffering will last a long time, but it will last for a limited time. God will ensure that it ends. He knows exactly the amount of days he will let it go along. As verse 14 puts it, the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. Okay, so what did this vision then mean for Daniel at this point in the vision, even before he gets a fuller explanation a little further on? What did it mean for Daniel at this point? Well, on the one hand, this vision is weirdly encouraging. Do you realize that? You say, why would this be encouraging for Daniel so far? Well, the vision shows that even though rams and goats and horns and empires and kings, they might look big, they might look unstoppable in their heyday, but eventually they all topple to the ground. Eventually, all these worldly kings are thrown on the trash heap of has-been rulers. None of them last. None of them can stand against the God of heaven. This vision would be encouraging to Daniel. It would also be encouraging to him because, did you notice these predictions here, these predictions of persecution, they also assume that God's people end up getting back from exile back into the land, and the temple is rebuilt, and the sacrificial system is reinstated. This vision assumes all of that. These would be encouraging promises from where Daniel sits as he sees this vision. At the same time, this vision for Daniel would be devastating and it would be terrifying. This vision predicts global calamity as empires collide. This vision culminates in a terrible king who defies God's temple and persecutes God's people with raging fury. And Daniel is told that there are limits to this fury, 2,300 evenings and mornings. But guess what? That number is rather vague, and the suffering is long and severe. If there's any time in Daniel's life where he might be tempted to hit the panic button, it's right here at this point in the vision. That's how he feels. This is a realistic prophecy. It's a realistic prophecy of the way that world history will continue to unfold. And in many ways, it's a grim picture. Brothers and sisters, as Christians, like Daniel, we too have been given a vision of the future that is both hope-filled on the one hand, but also realistic about suffering and evil on the other hand. It's a mixed picture. On the one hand, God has promised us that His Holy Spirit will sustain us no matter what. We've been promised that the gates of hell cannot prevail against God's church. We've been promised that the same Jesus who redeemed us by his blood will come again with glorious power on those clouds to vanquish sin, Satan, and death forever, to judge the world and to make all things new. These are glorious promises indeed. Brothers and sisters, our future as Christians is incredibly bright. But at the same time, we are also told by Jesus himself that as we look into the future, we should expect suffering. We should expect suffering and temptation and trials and opposition as we wait for his return. Here's how Jesus puts this in Mark chapter 13. He says, "And Jesus began to say to them, 'See that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name saying, I am he, and they will lead many astray. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines, but these are but the beginning of the birth pains. But be on your guard, for they will deliver you over to councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake to bear witness before them. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But the one who endures to the end will be saved.'" Those are sobering words from Jesus. If I could paraphrase, Jesus is saying, anticipate suffering. People of God, anticipate suffering. God was saying to Daniel through this vision, anticipate suffering, Daniel. Jesus is saying to us as his people, anticipate suffering until the day when I return. Things are going to get worse before they get better. You know, it helps when you anticipate suffering. It helps you endure when that suffering finally comes, when you've been anticipating it. For instance, what if somebody told you that you could get a knee replacement surgery, but there's going to be no pain whatsoever, 0 recovery time, it's just easy peasy, out goes one knee, boop, in goes another, and presto, you're good to go, you can run a marathon. If that's your expectation when you went into the surgery, to be sure you're going to have a terrible time in your actual recovery, aren't you? But on the other hand, if you anticipate the suffering that's involved, you're going to have a better time. If you anticipate that it's going to be painful, that it's going to be hard to bend your knee, that you're going to have to force it to bend no matter how you feel on any given day, that you're going to have to go through physical therapy day after day, if you anticipate all of that, you're not going to be shocked by the pain. No. You're going to have the right mindset to make it through. In the same way, if we can see history realistically and anticipate Christian suffering, we will be ready, friends. We will be ready to trust our God to take us through. I wonder, friends, have you bought into the false idea that the Christian life is a cakewalk free of trouble? There's a lot of people preaching that today. If you bought into that lie, I would encourage you. Think again in light of Daniel's prophecy here. Think again in light of Jesus' words that we read a moment before. Anticipate suffering. It's the normal Christian life as we wait for the day when Jesus comes to eradicate suffering for good. Now, maybe you say, well, wow, I mean, that's pretty depressing. Welcome to church. Thanks for this sermon. You say, Pastor, is there hope for us in the middle of this broken world with its trials and its persecutions and its sufferings? Well, yes, friend, there is hope. There is hope. There is hope because our God is sovereign over it all. And our God keeps his promises through it all. And our God will take us through it all. We see that next. We've looked at the vision. Notice next the meaning of the vision there in verses 15 through 26. Now, at this point, Daniel gets an interpretation of what he's just seen, and that interpretation comes from none other than Gabriel the angel. This is the very Gabriel who appears later in the Bible to Zechariah and to Mary, the mother of Jesus. It's the same Gabriel. And here Gabriel is like a heavenly therapist. He is helping Daniel to process everything that he's just seen. And so we pick it up then in verse 15. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood. And when he came, I was frightened, and I fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end. And when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep, with my face to the ground. But he touched me and made me stand up. He said, behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation. For it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. And the goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. He shall cause fearful destruction and shall succeed in what he does and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes. And he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. This is remarkable, isn't it? Verse 20 tells us explicitly that the ram, the one with those 2 large curly horns, one that's higher than the other, that ram is the empire of Medo-Persia. Persia is the higher horn, Media is the lower horn. This was a combined kingdom, as it were. And then in verse 21, it reveals that the goat is Greece, and the single horn on the goat is Greece's first global king. In other words, this is Alexander the Great. No wonder this goat appears as something so fast. By the age of 33, Alexander the Great had conquered the known world from Italy to India in record time. But then suddenly Alexander died. That horn was broken off. His 2 young sons were murdered. And catch this, his kingdom was divided up among his 4 generals. The 4 generals who are shown here as the 4 horns in verse 22. In light of all that, then, we could trace it through. Who is the king who arises from one of those 4 horns? Verse 23 calls him the king of bold face. In other words, he's very arrogant. We read that he understands riddles. In other words, he's very clever. Verse 24 says, his power shall be great, and he shall cause fearful destruction and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints, that is, the people of God. Verse 25 describes him as cunning and deceitful, and without warning he shall destroy many and even rise up against the prince of princes. That's a reference to God. Whoever this is, they will try to oppose God. Look, it's the same little horn described back in verses 9 through 12. Here he's described again. So who is he? Well, Gabriel doesn't tell Daniel explicitly who this is, but we know who this man is from actual history. His name is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Antiochus IV Epiphanes. His picture will come up. He arose from I think it's going to come up. There we go. He actually arose from the Seleucid dynasty, right? One of those 4 horns. He took his crown through cunning and political manipulation. His nickname, Epiphanes, it means God manifest. He thought of himself as the manifestation of Zeus. He rose to power in 175 BC. He tried to unify his kingdom by forcing Greek religion and culture down people's throats. He tried to force it upon all of his subjects, including the Jews. In 169 BC, on his way back from a campaign in Egypt, he perceived that there was a revolt going on in Jerusalem, and so he comes in with military force and kills thousands of Jews and takes thousands more away as slaves, and he loots the Jewish temple of its treasures. In 167 BC, he sends his chief tax collector to Jerusalem and launches a surprise attack on Jerusalem, slaughtering many, many more. In December of 167 BC, Antiochus halted the Jewish temple sacrifices, and he set up a sacred object to Zeus inside of the Jewish temple. And he sacrificed a pig on the altar of the Jewish temple. He forced Jews in the surrounding cities to sacrifice to pagan gods. He burned Torah scrolls and prohibited Jewish rituals like the Sabbath and circumcision. Anyone caught resisting was put to death. It was truly a bloodbath. And as you may know, all of this led to a full-scale Jewish revolt led by the Maccabees. The Maccabees assembled, defeated the Seleucids, pushed them back, rescued Jerusalem again, came back to the temple, cleansed the temple, and started up those sacrifices once again. In December 167 BC, the sacrificial system was reenacted. As you may know, this Maccabean victory and the rededication of the temple, it's celebrated today during Hanukkah. That's what Hanukkah is all about. Now, friends, look, here's what's so amazing. Everything described of the little horn in Daniel chapter 8 comes true with extraordinary accuracy. From the persecution of God's people, to acting like a god, to stopping the temple sacrifices, to desecrating the temple itself, even the time period. Remember that 2,300 evenings and mornings? Well, if you calculate it to be a little more than 3 years, it's roughly equivalent to the little more than 3 years between when Antiochus stopped the temple sacrifices and Judas Maccabeus started them up again. We're told in verse 25 that he shall be broken, but by no human hand. Antiochus eventually died, but not in battle by any human hand. It's a bit debated, but it's likely that he died from some kind of sudden disease. It's like God took him down. Brothers and sisters, I want to ask you, are you encouraged that our God can predict world events like these long before they ever happened? Are you here this morning and perhaps you're not yet a Christian? Would you consider Daniel chapter 8? It's so amazing. All of these things predicted long before they ever came to pass, and they all came to pass. Think about it. Daniel sees this vision in 547 BC, and Antiochus comes to the throne more than 3.5 centuries later. This one chapter predicts the rise and fall of Medo-Persia, the rise of Greece, the rise of Alexander the Great, plus his 4 generals, and a Seleucid king who persecutes the Jews with unprecedented cruelty. This chapter also predicts the return of the Jews to their land, the rebuilding of their temple, the stopping and the restarting of their sacrifices. Come on, everything's here. This is amazing. In fact, most theologically liberal scholars refuse to believe that Daniel actually predicted these events because they're too accurate to history. And so what these skeptical scholars do is they just simply date the book well after these events occurred. And they do that in order to get around the fact that these things really were predicted long ago. So what's the message? What's the message for Daniel at this point? What's the message for God's people living in exile? What's the message for us? Well, did you notice there in verse 26? Look there. Daniel is told, seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. In other words, Daniel should write this vision down, roll up the scroll, seal it, and then store it away for safekeeping so that the people of God down the line can open that scroll back up and read it when they are going through these perilous times that are predicted in chapter 8. And so we ask, what would this prophecy show the Jews who were going through persecution during the time of Antiochus? What would they learn when they unrolled Daniel's scroll and read it when they faced so much heat? What would they learn from it? Well, here's what they would see. This prophecy would show them that their God is still in control, no matter what's happening around them. He's still in control. Their God is not surprised by their persecution. He is sovereign over it all. He's already foretold every detail. He already predicted the rise of Medo-Persia, then Greece, then those generals, then that Seleucid king. God already foretold persecution and blasphemy and terror that they would go through. God already predicted that that little horn would be vanquished and the pain would only last for 2,300 evenings and mornings. Suffering would be long, but suffering would be limited. That's what they would see. God's promises would come true. So hold on. Don't panic. That's what this vision says to the people of God. Don't panic. No, trust. Trust God's providence. Trust God's promises. He's going to get you through. Look, that's a really important message for us today, isn't it? See, God is sovereign over history, and God keeps his promises. That's good news. Friends, the whole Old Testament is filled with promises and predictions that God would one day send Jesus to atone for our sins and to die and to rise again. And hear me, all those promises came true, didn't they? And in light of that, now we can look ahead to God's promises, still ahead, the promise that Christ will come again, and he will reign, and he will make all things new. And though he's promised suffering for his people, he's also promised victory for all who put their trust in Jesus Christ. Have you put your trust in Jesus Christ? Then this God's promises are all yours. So church family, look, as you look out at the world and the future and the challenges of your everyday life, you don't have to hit the panic button. You can trust the God who always fulfills his promises. He ordains all things. He governs all things. Nothing stands outside of his control. As R.C. Sproul once put it so well, there is not a maverick molecule in the whole universe. No, everything is superintended by God's meticulous sovereignty. So with Daniel, you can rest assured God's got you in his hands, whatever you're going through. Well, we've seen the vision. We've looked at the meaning of the vision. The question is, how should we respond when we see the world like Daniel sees it here? Notice, finally, a faithful response to the vision. A faithful response to the vision there in verse 27. Look there, verse 27. And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I rose and I went about the king's business. But I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. Notice Daniel here is strikingly realistic about what he has seen. This vision predicted great pain and suffering and struggle for the people of God, and Daniel tells us he is overcome. He has to take some sick days, right? He lies there sick in bed. He's honest, notice, he's honest in saying that he's appalled by these things, and he's humble in admitting that he doesn't understand all the details. You might think Daniel, at this point, would run for cover or build a bunker or become a monk or just withdraw from society, right? But no, he doesn't do any of that. Shockingly, we read these words. right in the middle of the verse. Then I rose and I went about the king's business. Listen, what does Daniel do now that he knows? Now that he knows history will be filled with evil empires and conquest and tyrannical horns and great persecution for God's people. What does Daniel do now that he knows that at the same time history will demonstrate God's sovereignty and God's people will have victory in the end, but they'll go through great suffering in order to get there? What will Daniel do now that he knows all of this? Here's what Daniel does. He gets out of bed. He puts on his uniform. He laces up his shoes. And he gets back to work, serving a pagan king, making a difference in the beastly empire of Babylon, using his skills to serve in society in which God has placed him. Here's what Daniel does after seeing all this. He gets back to work, serving a human king faithfully, because ultimately, he serves the true king, God himself. Daniel is a powerful example for us in our day. As Christians living in a broken world that is often ferocious, while we wait for Christ to return, like Daniel, we shouldn't panic. We shouldn't withdraw. No. We should see the future realistically, step toward the world, and make a difference right where God has placed us. Where has God placed you to make a difference? Bible commentator Ian Duguid, he puts it well. He says this, quote, "Whether our calling is changing diapers or cleaning the kitchen, filing reports or designing aircraft, painting pictures or making music, teaching students or tending the sick, we should be about whatever business the great king has assigned us. Whenever our master returns, whether soon or at a distant time, he should find us obediently and productively at work when he comes." Amen to that. See, we know how history unfolds, don't we? There will be suffering for God's people, and there will be joy and hope and victory. Meanwhile, like Daniel, we need to get to work. Get to work serving the king wherever he's put you. See, there's really just two responses for God's people when we face both the sufferings and the joys of our world and our future and our lives. Two responses. We can panic or we can trust. We can hit the panic button, or we can trust the providence and the promises of our God. What do you face today, friend? What do you face today? Don't hit the panic button. No, I want you to trust the GOAT, the true GOAT, the greatest of all time. God the Father, God the Son, God the Spirit. What he promises, he will do. Therefore, he's got you in his hands, no matter what you face.